When they actually penetrated this small door, they found a hidden room within the pyramid.
Tutankhamun's mask is an icon. And I think part of it is because it is made of solid gold, and a lot of people get wowed.
The face is wrong. Not the gold, not the lapis lazuli, not the obsidian eyes that have stared out from museum posters for a century. The face itself, the actual face of Tutankhamun, the one the entire world recognizes, the one reproduced on everything from textbooks to coffee mugs. It's attached with solder marks. Visible, undeniable solder marks, running along the interior seam where the face meets the rest of the mask. Someone cut a face off and put a different one on. When researchers ran advanced spectral imaging across the surface of the world's most famous artifact, they didn't expect what came back. The face is made of immeasurably different gold than the rest of the mask. Not slightly different, different enough that it could only mean one thing. Two pieces were made separately, in different metalworking sessions, possibly years apart, possibly for two entirely different people. The mask that the entire field of Egyptology has used as the defining portrait of a pharaoh for 100 years may not have been his to begin with. That's the thing nobody prepared you for. Not the tomb, not the mummy, not the curse. The mask itself, the iconic object, the symbol of ancient Egypt, was apparently recycled, stripped of its original face, and handed to a dead teenager. And once you know what the scans found underneath, the story of Tutankhamun doesn't just look different. It looks like it was hiding something the ancient Egyptians themselves tried to erase. The mask has been in the same building for most of the past century. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo, then more recently the Grand Egyptian Museum just outside the city. It sits behind climate-controlled glass, lit from angles that make the gold glow warm and deep. It weighs just over 10 kilograms, more than 22 pounds of layered gold sheet, hammered cold, shaped to fit the mummified head of a boy who died sometime around 1323 BCE. Howard Carter's team found it on October 28, 1925, when they lifted the lid of the innermost of 3 nested coffins. Carter wrote in his diary that the mask appeared to him as though it had never been touched. 3,250 years in the dark, and the gold looked like it had been polished that morning. For decades, it was studied mainly as an object of art. Its proportions, its symbolism, its inscriptions, the spell running down the back in hieroglyphs, the cobra and vulture on the forehead, the lapis lazuli stripes of the Nemes headcloth. What nobody seriously examined, until scientists began applying materials analysis tools to it in the early 2000s, was what the gold itself could tell them. Researchers brought in X-ray diffraction and fluorescence technology, instruments that fire controlled beams of radiation at a surface and read the specific energies bounced back, allowing them to map the chemical composition of the metal without touching it, without damaging a single atom of a 3,000-year-old surface. The equipment sat a few millimeters from the gold and read it like a fingerprint. The lab was quiet, except for the hum of the device. The mask sat as it always had. What changed was what the numbers said when they came back. The face and neck of the mask are coated in a thin layer of 18-karat gold alloy, a deliberately paler, slightly whitish gold. The rest of the mask, the headdress, the collar, the broad shoulders, is coated in 22.5-karat gold. Those are not the same. They are visibly, measurably distinct. The body of the mask was built one way, the face was coated another way, and when researchers looked closer at the underlying structure, they found something that changed the question entirely. The mask's ears. They're pierced. That's a detail that had been noted by Carter's team in 1925, and then, for reasons that remain unexplained, quietly set aside. In ancient Egypt, adult male rulers did not wear earrings. Pierced ears were associated with women and children. The holes are real. They are not decorative. They are the kind made to hold jewelry, the kind made for someone else entirely. There is one more detail, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't appear in the press coverage, but sits in the scholarly literature like an unanswered question. The cartouches on the mask, the carved ovals containing the pharaoh's royal names, show faint, unmistakable signs of having been altered. A name was carved there before Tutankhamun's name, and someone changed it. In 2015, a British Egyptologist published a detailed structural analysis of the mask that the field had been circling around for years, but hadn't yet confronted directly. The conclusion was stark. The face section of the mask, the piece representing Tutankhamun, was manufactured separately from everything else, not as a stylistic choice, not as a practical quirk of production, separately, in a different gold alloy, and then soldered on. The interior of the mask shows the seam clearly. Rivets, solder joints, a face grafted onto a body it was never designed for. The Egyptologist's word for it, used in the published paper, was replaced. Let that word do its work. Replaced. Meaning there was a face there before, meaning someone removed it and put Tutankhamun's face in its place. The face currently on the world's most famous artifact is, by the weight of the physical evidence, a substitution. The rest of the mask, the headdress, the collar, the broad gold body inscribed with spells, shows internal evidence that it was made for someone with pierced ears, someone for whom earrings were appropriate, someone whose name was originally carved into those cartouches before it was chiseled out and replaced. The Egyptologist's analysis of the altered cartouche is painstaking. Beneath Tutankhamun's royal names, the inscribed traces of an earlier name remain legible in raking light. The royal nomenclature of a ruler known to history as Nefer-Neferuaten, a female pharaoh, who may have been Nefertiti. The mask wasn't built for the boy king. It was built for a woman. The face was swapped, the name was changed, and the whole assembly was placed over the head of a teenager who apparently died so unexpectedly that his court had to scramble to bury him at all. The data doesn't care about what we were taught in school. The team sat with that result for a while. It's the kind of finding that requires you to reassemble something in your head before you can talk about it. Here is the thing about Tutankhamun's tomb that gets glossed over in every museum exhibit, every documentary, every school textbook. It's small, embarrassingly small, for a pharaoh. The Valley of the Kings contains royal tombs that stretch deep into the limestone, vast, multi-chambered constructions designed over years of active planning, filled with hundreds of square meters of painted walls, false chambers, trap corridors, all of it coordinated. The tombs of Ramesses the Great, of Seti I, of Thutmose III. These are architectural projects of enormous ambition. Tutankhamun's tomb is the smallest royal tomb in the valley. Its main burial chamber is barely larger than a modern living room. The painted walls are incomplete in places. Researchers who analyzed the paint found something unexpected: mold blooms visible on the walls, consistent with organic material. Possibly flowers, possibly fresh food left as offerings that had not been allowed sufficient time to dry before the tomb was sealed. A closed tomb, sealed in haste, before the inside had finished drying. The scenario that emerges from this evidence is one that Egyptologists have been gradually assembling for decades. Tutankhamun died young, suddenly, possibly without warning, and his officials had to bury a pharaoh in a tomb that wasn't built for him, with burial equipment that wasn't built for him. The mask was already made. It was sitting in a royal funerary workshop, assembled for a predecessor who had never been buried with it, a predecessor who had simply vanished from the record. The court officials took the mask, changed the cartouche, replaced the face, sealed it over the mummy of the new king. One researcher who has written extensively on the Amarna period put it bluntly in a journal article: the reuse of funerary equipment in this period was common, not because the Egyptians were cavalier about the dead, but because the political situation following the religious revolution of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's probable father, had left the royal court in chaos. Nefer-Neferuaten, the female pharaoh who preceded Tutankhamun, appears in no tomb. Her burial goods are scattered across Tutankhamun's tomb, like parts of a kit that were repurposed rather than used. The mask is the most visible piece of that kit. If the mask is the most famous object in Tutankhamun's tomb, the dagger is the most unsettling. Researchers confirmed it in 2016 using portable X-ray fluorescence technology, the same family of imaging tools used on the mask. They took the machine to the Egyptian Museum, held it close to the blade without touching it, and read the radiation it emitted back. The iron in the dagger contains more than 10% nickel. That is not a number found in any iron ore deposit on Earth. It is, however, the exact composition of iron meteorite. The dagger buried with Tutankhamun was made from a rock that fell from space. Ancient Egyptians had a word for iron: iron of the sky. They weren't being poetic. They were being precise. In the Bronze Age, almost all iron objects were meteoritic, because humans hadn't yet developed the technology to smelt iron ore from the ground. If you wanted iron, you found a meteorite. But the 2022 follow-up analysis, published in the journal Meteoritics and Planetary Science, went further. They mapped the chemistry of the gold hilt, and they found calcium-bearing lime plaster used as an adhesive on the hilt's decorations. That is a problem, because lime plaster technology didn't develop in Egypt until the Ptolemaic period, several centuries after Tutankhamun's death. In ancient Egypt, craftsmen used gypsum-based plaster. Lime plaster belonged to the cultures of Anatolia to the north, to the region that was, at the time, home to the Mitanni Empire. The Amarna letters, Hundreds of clay diplomatic tablets discovered near Tutankhamun's probable birthplace record in detail a gift sent from the Mitanni king to Tutankhamun's grandfather, Amenhotep III, an iron dagger with a gold hilt as a wedding gift. The dagger in the tomb, forged from a meteorite, may not have been made for Tutankhamun. It may have been an heirloom passed down 2 generations, originating from a foreign empire as a diplomatic gesture. A weapon from the sky, literally wrapped in the technology of another civilization. The king was buried with things that weren't his, in a tomb that wasn't built for him, wearing a mask that was made for someone else. There are simpler explanations for some of this. The reuse of burial goods was documented practice. The dagger could have been a treasured heirloom by conscious choice. Some Egyptologists read the mask evidence differently. The field is not unanimous, but the data doesn't disappear when the debate gets complicated. If you're finding this fascinating, a like genuinely helps this channel keep investigating these kinds of mysteries. A few years ago, a video making the rounds on YouTube claimed that Tutankhamun's tomb contained evidence of a hidden chamber, and that the chamber held the mummy of Nefertiti herself, sealed behind a false wall. The video racked up several 100,000 views. The claim circulated across social media platforms for months. Fact-checkers correctly identified it as unverified. Radar surveys of the tomb walls in 2016 initially seemed to show anomalies consistent with a void behind the northern wall. A team using ground-penetrating radar concluded there might be a corridor behind the painted plaster. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities announced it would investigate. Further surveys, using more sophisticated equipment, returned more ambiguous results. The consensus among researchers now is that the evidence for a hidden chamber is inconclusive at best. The rumor was wrong, or at least premature. But here is what the rumor was responding to, even if it couldn't articulate it precisely. Neferuaten was never buried. That is a verifiable fact. A pharaoh of ancient Egypt, who reigned for at minimum 2 years and possibly longer, left no tomb, no confirmed burial, no completed funerary assemblage. Her burial goods appear distributed across Tutankhamun's tomb. The mask, a middle coffin, gold miniature coffins for his internal organs, a gold pectoral ornament, objects that bear her name, altered, or that show structural evidence of having been made for a different body. Where is she? That's the question the viral video was trying to answer, clumsily, with radar readings it overclaimed. But the underlying absence, the missing pharaoh, the missing burial, that's not a rumor. That's a documented gap in the record that no one has closed. The hidden chamber may not exist. The missing person certainly does. Step back from the technical findings for a moment. The mask, the dagger, the tomb, the missing predecessor, they describe a specific historical situation that is documented, verifiable, and genuinely strange. Tutankhamun came to the throne around 1332 BCE. As a child of approximately 9 years old, he inherited a kingdom that had just survived a religious revolution. His probable father, Akhenaten, had spent nearly 2 decades dismantling Egypt's entire theological framework, abolishing the traditional gods, declaring the sun disk Aten the sole divine force, founding a new capital city in the desert, purging the priestly class. When Akhenaten died, the experiment collapsed. The priests of Amun returned, the old gods were restored, the new capital was abandoned, and somewhere in that collapse, a female pharaoh, almost certainly Nefertiti, operating under a male throne name, appears briefly in the record and then vanishes entirely. Some scholars argue that Neferuaten didn't simply retire or die quietly. They argue she was erased, deliberately, systematically, her name chiseled from monuments, her burial never completed, her existence compressed into footnotes. In ancient Egypt, erasing a pharaoh's name from monuments was not vandalism. It was a calculated act of damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory, the most extreme punishment an Egyptian court could inflict. You didn't just erase a person, you erased their path to the afterlife. If that interpretation is correct, the mask becomes something darker, not a practical repurposing of burial equipment in a moment of administrative chaos. Something closer to a cover-up, her face removed, her name overwritten, her possessions distributed to a successor whose reign would officially mark the return to orthodoxy. The authenticated fact sitting beneath this: we know the cartouche was altered. That is not speculation. It has been examined under raking light and photographed. Someone changed the name on the world's most famous artifact. One controversial theory, carefully framed as such by the researchers who have proposed it, goes further. If Nefertiti did rule as pharaoh, and if her burial was deliberately suppressed, then the objects in Tutankhamun's tomb are not merely recycled goods. They are, in a strange sense, stolen, taken from a woman whose existence the political forces of her era wanted extinguished, and repurposed for a child king who would be used to stabilize a theologically and politically fractured court. The boy became the face of the Restoration. Literally. There's an interpretation, offered by scholars in the Amarna period literature, that Tutankhamun was never expected to amount to much historically. He was a minor king with a small tomb, a short reign, and a court that buried him with other people's things. His fame today is entirely an accident of archaeology. Carter's team chose the right location in the right year, and the tomb had been covered by flood debris for millennia. If the tomb had never been found, Nefer-Neferuaten's name would appear on a few scattered monuments, altered and obscure. Tutankhamun would be a footnote. The mask would probably never have been seen again. Instead, it became the most recognizable object in the world, representing a face it may never have been meant to carry, belonging to a king who may have inherited it by administrative necessity, wearing the name of a predecessor that 3,000 years of dirt and politics almost erased. Of course, there are simpler explanations for all of this. Historians are cautious about over-dramatizing what may have been unremarkable bureaucratic decisions made in a busy funerary workshop. Reusing a predecessor's burial equipment was not dishonest by the standards of the time. The altered cartouche may reflect a straightforward dynastic transfer, not a cover-up. But the fact remains, the face on the mask isn't original. The name beneath the name is still faintly there, and the person it was made for has never been found. The mask is at the Grand Egyptian Museum now. It made the move from the old Cairo Museum building to the new facility, a vast glass and stone complex built at the edge of the Giza Plateau, within sight of the pyramids, after decades of planning. The transfer happened with tremendous logistical care. The mask was cushioned, stabilized, transported by a team that understood they were moving an object with no replacement and no duplicate anywhere on Earth. It sits today in a purpose-built gallery, lit to emphasize the depth of the gold, visible from multiple angles. Millions of visitors a year pass in front of it. Most of them see it as the face of Tutankhamun. What the spectral imaging found, and what the structural analysis confirmed, is that this was always, in some sense, a disguise. The boy himself, whatever he was in life, was 9 years old when he became pharaoh. He grew up in the ruins of his father's revolution, trying to restore something that had been deliberately broken, ruling a country still working out what it believed about its gods and its kings and itself. He seems to have been fond of hunting. His tomb contained archery equipment that showed genuine wear, used, not ceremonial. He had a walking stick that bore traces of actual use, not display. He suffered from a bone disease that made walking difficult. He was, by the physical evidence, a real teenager in a real body, dealing with real pain in one of the most politically volatile reigns in Egyptian history. He died before he was 20. He didn't leave a written account of his life. He didn't finish whatever he started. His name was erased by successors who wanted the Amarna period forgotten. And then, 3,000 years later, the accident of archaeology returned him to the most famous face on Earth. The irony is that the face the world knows may not be his either. Not entirely. The face on the mask, Tutankhamun's idealized portrait, matches other depictions of him found in the tomb. It is, in that sense, his face. But it was soldered onto a body built for someone else. Someone whose identity was being suppressed at the very moment the mask was being modified. He became famous in a mask that wasn't made for him. He became famous for a face that replaced another face. He became the symbol of ancient Egypt because he was buried in someone else's things, in someone else's tomb, wearing a name carved over someone else's name. The technology that revealed this didn't damage a single atom of the artifact. It just read what was already there, what had always been there, for 3,000 years, waiting for a machine precise enough to ask the right question. There's a particular kind of silence that follows that kind of finding. The mask is still beautiful. That doesn't change. Gold doesn't lose its value because of what it's hiding, but the question of who that face was really made for, that one stays open. Here's what the evidence leaves us with. A female pharaoh built the mask. A male pharaoh's face replaced hers. Her name was changed. Her burial was never completed, and her successor, a child, surrounded by her repurposed belongings, became the most famous king in Egyptian history. So here's the question the data forces. Was Tutankhamun a grieving heir, buried with the only things available in a moment of administrative crisis? A child king given a patchwork burial by loyal officials doing their best? Or was he a tool, a compliant face placed over something older and more dangerous? A convenient restoration king whose entire reign was stage-managed to erase the woman who came before him, whose possessions couldn't be destroyed and so were simply overwritten. The mask is in Cairo right now. The solder marks are still there. The faint traces of the altered cartouche haven't gone anywhere. If this changed how you see the most famous object in ancient history, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The rest of the story is still being written.